Hello and welcome. You are joining us once again, live on a Friday, for the Investor Lab, the home, passionate people seeking a life of freedom, choice, and abundance. Gabby, how are you today?
I'm fabulous. How are you, Goose?
Good. Have I interrupted your multitasking?
Come on, man. I'm doing well.
You do.
Still talking, still fading. We're good. How are you?
Did you say, who am I? My name is Goose.
My name is Gabby. We haven't done that in a very long time. Anyway.
A little fatigued today, but that's okay.
Oh.
But I'm excited.
Okay.
I'm excited. I'm excited about today's episode. So if you're here joining us live in the chat, if you're joining us here live on YouTube, let us know in the chat is what I meant to say. Super excited to see you. Super excited I need to get the chat up so I can see who's saying hello. Oh, wow, there's a whole bunch of people here.
Yeah,
Rich, Matt, Let's Rock, Neutral Rockets, Harpreet, great to see you all. And for those of you who are here and not in the chat but still joining us live, hello to you too. Hello to all the regulars. We love seeing you here. We have got something special cooked up for today. And in fact, let me give a bit of a background to why we're doing what we're doing today. So I'll be honest with you. On Tuesday, we still didn't know what the topic was going to be for today's podcast. And then I started thinking on Wednesday, I was thinking about GDP. And I asked myself, and I said, what happens if you divide the GDP by the money supply? So that's interesting. So I went and had a little play with that. And then it was like, whoops, can of worms massively opened. Now, a theme that Gabby and I have been really, really interested in exploring, and we've personally been exploring this whole concept for the entirety of this year. And basically, is why is it getting harder to get ahead? Why is it getting harder to get ahead? And so, if you have joined us throughout the year, you will have noticed that if you go back and look at the episodes, you'll see that that's the theme that's permeated through pretty much everything we've been doing for this entire year. Why it's getting harder to get ahead and what to do about it. That's basically been the theme, right? And so. When I started pulling on this thread and accidentally opening up a big can of worms around, all these kind of key things divided by M3 money supply, it started to unravel a whole bunch of other stuff that we wanted to talk about. And it became too much for us to be able to try and get into one episode. And so we decided we were going to do a series. Now, for those of you who are in the community, you may have seen that we said that we're going to do a 5-part series. But Gabby, this is news to you. Maybe it's not going to be 5 parts. We don't know. It might be more. so
it might be. Depends how wonky you get.
Yeah, it might be more. But I think, and it may not be exactly the structure that we laid out in the community either. But cool. the important thing here is we are going to do a multi-part series.
Yep.
Until we feel like we have sufficiently explored the topic or explored the idea around why getting ahead is getting harder and what to do about it. And the reason that we're doing this is because I think that this is one of the most important things that people can understand today. And you've heard us talk about, like, if you've listened to this podcast at all, you will have heard us talk about many of these things before. But the fact of the matter is that once upon a time, through the fruits of your labor, you were able to raise a family, buy a home, and live a prosperous life on a single income. And that has all changed. And why has that changed? Well, we live in a broken system with broken money. Now, things are accelerating and it is getting harder to get ahead. And we've covered this in a multitude of different ways. And so if you care about yourself, your future, your family, your prosperity, if you want to work out what is wrong and then how to fix it, that's really what we're going to be covering over these next multi-part series. I say multi-part because I think there's going to be a lot that goes into it. First, we're going to need to talk about the problem. We're going to need to kind of frame that up, like what is actually going on here, which we've done some stuff in previous episodes, and we're going to try and cover over old ground. But then also the what to do about it is also really interesting as well, and where are we going? So I'm excited to get into it today. Gabby, anything you want to add?
I think just on the series, like, it's, from my perspective, we talk about this stuff every single week. We've done this live every week pretty much since the start of the year. And a lot of people love you guys that join live every week. And we still have heaps of people that tune in throughout the following week and ongoing. But these topics we do talk about every single week. But I think what's exciting to me about this series is that we're kind of trying to repackage it all in a way that's like, here's the fundamentals. Like, if you want that fundamental understanding of why you feel like it is getting harder to get ahead, which most people do right now, here is this fundamental understanding to help you realize why you feel that way, because it's not just a feeling, as we start to pull apart over the next couple of weeks. It's like, it's not just in your head, and everybody's feeling the same way, and there are reasons behind that. And so I'm excited to pull it all together into one place.
Yeah. Now, what I would say is, if this is your starting point, if this episode is your starting point, go back and listen to the first episode from this year, because actually that is one piece that's missing from this whole, like, everything that we're going to do with this series. We're not going to cover over the first episode we did, which is effectively like, what is money, and how does it work? That episode is foundational to the understanding, and we're not going to recover that. We're not going to talk about types of money. We're not going to do that. We're going to kind of take it from there and go, where do we go next? How do we move on from there? So I would say go back and listen to that first episode from this year. I can't remember. I love it, but the thumbnail says, "What is money?"
What is money?
Oh, there you go. Cool. So that's kind of the foundation episode. This is going to be building on that and building on some of the themes that we've covered this year. So should we get stuck into it?
Let's do it.
Okay. So this all started by with a bit of a line of questioning that I had, which was like, okay, so if GDP is continuing to go up and wages keep rising, why does it feel like everyone's getting further and further behind? Like, why don't we feel like we're getting ahead? And why does it feel like, the government can say, hey, GDP is going up, but, there's people literally marching in the streets in Australia at the moment because standard of living is going down and it's getting harder to get ahead and everyone's feeling the squeeze. So kind of like what feels like a boom is actually feeling like a squeeze at the dinner table. And that's not a good place to be. So why is that? Now, the starting place that I started was GDP. So let's first talk about what GDP is. I think is a good place to start. So GDP broadly is a measure of the economic output of a country. Okay. It is, there's a couple of different ways to think about it. So on the one hand, it is the value, the total market value of all of the goods and services produced within a country during a specific time period, typically a year, primarily measured by summing consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, right? So it's basically how much does a country produce? So it's the economic output of a country over any given year. And the main components of GDP are consumption, so consumer spending, all that kind of stuff, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. And so what's interesting about that is just one little kind of byline on that, which I hadn't planned to sort of dig into. One byline on that is government spending. So if governments control the money printer and they can spend, and government spending makes up GDP, then government spending can be a driver of GDP when in fact it's creating net deficits on the balance sheet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's super interesting in terms of like GDP becomes this holy metric that the government use again to kind of like highlight how well the economy is doing and growing. And part of what makes up that measurement is actually their own spending, which is just very interesting because, again, not a lot of people kind of like peel back the one layer to realize that that's what's going on as well.
Yeah. So GDP has been going up pretty significantly over since 1960. We've gone from about 20 billion GDP to about 2.6 trillion today. So I'm just going to share some charts. We're going to walk through some charts as we go through this kind of stuff. Now, forewarned is forearmed here, guys. Some of the stuff that we're going to show you may be confronting, maybe even a little harrowing. you may be, because I'll be honest, when I started going through this stuff and started unpacking this, and I was downloading the data sets and building up the chart packs and all that kind of stuff, I was a bit like, I actually felt like my head was getting blown off because I've got a pretty good idea about how this stuff shakes out. But even I was like, holy shit, this is hectic. So GDP has grown from around 20 million annual economic output to about 2.6 trillion today. So if you look at nominal GDP, it looks like Australia has been booming. And in fact, Australia has a great reputation as being an economic powerhouse and that it's, experienced all this prosperity for so much time, and what a lucky country, and all of this kind of stuff. But we have to then consider, okay, how does this also work if the money supply has also been going up? So if we take a look at the M3 money supply, now what is M3 money supply? M3, so there's a couple of different measures of money, and I won't go into them too much here, but you've got M1, which covers cash and kind of checking deposits. It's kind of the most basic form of money. Then you've got M2, which kind of is a broader term, and M3 includes everything in M1 plus savings accounts, plus credit, plus term deposits, basically anything that can be considered liquid capital, which is very interesting because it's really, really important, because it also factors in, because it includes credit, which is really interesting. And I actually think that like if you look at if you are into, watching videos on financial stuff on YouTube, you'll hear a lot of people talking about M2, because globally M2 is more of a common point of reference. But it's very interesting that because M3 probably should be the broader reference, because that includes credit and derivatives and things that can be used like money. So if you're able to use stuff to purchase other stuff, we should be treating it in the same. Now, Australia uses M3, not M2, as the primary measurement of money, and it is broader, so it is a bigger base, but nonetheless, it's still a standard unit of measurement. Make sense so far, Katie?
Yep, all good.
Awesome. Slow me down and help me dig into stuff if there's stuff you think we need to dig in a little bit more. And I'm not looking at the chat either, so if there's stuff that comes up in the chat, just let me know. All right. Yep. So we started here, and we can say, okay, since 1960, looks like the economy in Australia is booming. Look at that, straight up and to the right. I mean, if this was this looks like Nvidia or something like that. This looks like a stock chart that you'd be like, yeah, give me some of that. I want in on that action.
Yeah.
Well, it does. It looks like that, right? But then let's take a look at the M3 money supply. Okay, that's interesting. That's also pretty much straight up and to the right. So instantly, we need to ask ourselves, like, okay, if the economy is going up, but also the money is going up, what happens if you divide GDP by M3 money supply? Well, that starts to tell a very different story. So when we do that, you can see here the red line is GDP divided by M3 index, and this is indexed to the same point, right? So now this is not going to show the full story. I'm going to get to the red line specifically in a moment, but you can instantly see the massive, massive discrepancy between nominal GDP, which is the blue line, and GDP divided by M3 money supply. Now let's take a slightly different look. This is Australian GDP adjusted for M3 money supply. So basically Australian GDP divided by M3 money supply. So in 1960, the index begins at 100, right? And by 2024, the index has fallen to just 22.4. So what that basically means is that since 1960, there's been a 78% collapse in economic output per unit of money, which is pretty crazy. Does that make sense? Or put it another way. Let me put it another way. Nominal GDP has grown nearly 9,400%, but because money supply grew even faster, it's actually been a 78% collapse. So it's a difference between 9,400% positive and 78% negative.
Yeah. So just to clarify, so what we're comparing here is basically like the previous two charts that you showed were both going up, right? So they both look positive.
Yeah. So let's go.
But when you compare the
two,
yeah,
so let's go back to them just to make sure people are understanding this. So this is nominal GDP. This is GDP measured in dollars.
Yep.
Cool. But if you so that looks like it's going up and to the right. But if you are increasing the amount of dollars, right? So you've got a numerator and a denominator here. Okay. And so the numerator is GDP and the denominator is dollars. And so if you, let's say if you double the amount of dollars in a system, this is a quantity theory of money. So if you double the amount of dollars in a system, then all you're doing is repricing everything by a factor of 2, right? Because it's the same amount of dollars chasing, or it's twice the amount of dollars chasing the same amount of stuff. Does that make sense? Yep. So we have GDP going up and to the right, priced in dollars, but then we also have dollars going up and to the right. So if we normalize that out and said, well, what if we didn't grow dollars? What is the actual economic output of the country per, like in real terms? Then you can see here, this is a 78% collapse in real GDP. Does that make sense?
That's the gap. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the gap. So this is the monetary inflation adjusted GDP for Australia since 1960. Now, what's interesting here is you'll also notice that there's a big spike where things actually did go up. So if you go from 1960 to just after 1970 to the mid 1970s, things were going up. That's interesting. And then in 1971, the US went off the gold standard, and the US being the global reserve currency basically meant that everyone went off the gold standard. What's interesting, by the way, is that Australia actually went off the gold standard in 1913, which is interesting. But the main driver of the global economy, the US dollar, went off the gold standard in 1971. And you can see from the point that the US went off the gold standard and every other country basically floated against the US dollar, the GDP in real terms has crashed in non-inflated dollars. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just wondering if we should do a quick 30-second refresher on what going off the gold standard meant.
Yeah, okay, cool. We can do that. So once upon a time, money. So what we have to remember is what we call money, which is dollars. So Australian dollars, US dollars, Turkish lira, British pounds. That is not money. They are currencies. They are political currencies. So all they are effectively the same as poker chips. So if you go to LA, so if you go to Las Vegas, and if you go to the Bellagio, and you go into the Bellagio and you want to play on the Bellagio's poker tables or whatever on their tables, you need to go and exchange US political currency for Bellagio currency, which is their chips, their branded chips. And you can't take their chips and go spend them somewhere else because they won't accept the chips, right? So the currencies are valid within the political jurisdictions typically. If you take US dollars to Thailand, you need to exchange them for the political currency in Thailand, which is the Thai baht, right? So what we think of as money is actually just currency. Now, for currencies to have value, typically what happened in the past is they would be tied to a scarce, hard, desirable asset like gold. So that would be backed by something like gold or potentially silver. Now, what's interesting, and we touched on this a little bit in last week's episode, is that because silver had a lower stock to flow ratio than gold, it was not as good a form of capital preservation as gold. So therefore, countries that are on a silver standard, their currencies weakened versus countries that were on a gold standard. Because effectively what happened in the past is that a certain amount of currency would be exchangeable directly for a certain amount of gold. And that gave you a peg against gold. So it would be pegged to the value of gold. So it effectively had a backing. So that would be, say, they were on a gold standard, or it was backed by gold. Now, what happened in 1971 is the US said, we are no longer going to have the value of the currency pegged to any specific amount of gold. In fact, it's no longer convertible for gold. And so what they basically said was, we will just print as much money as we want, and it's not backed by anything except trust. Now, that is called fiat currency. Fiat is a derivative of a Latin term, which means by decree or because I said so. So why is $10 worth $10? Because it is fiat, because I said so, right? So it's just literally because I said so. That's why. And so in effect, what happened is all currencies that went off a gold standard or went off a sound money standard all floated into effectively having no actual value. Now, what that also allowed is governments to print an excessive amount of money to fund continuous growth in nominal terms or optical terms, right? So it can seem like everyone's making more money. So when your wages go up, or when house prices go up, or when when things go up, it can feel like everyone's getting wealthier or making more money. But in fact, what this chart here shows is that you can print more money and prosperity can go backwards. So this effectively is showing that the economic output per unit of money that we've had in Australia has completely crashed, which is the inverse of the story we get told. Does that make sense?
Awesome. Yeah. And ours just sent through in the chat, I've just understood what this chart shows, and oh dear. Yes.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
And guys, just get ready, because there's a fair bit more of this to come. And so
there's more.
If this is not making sense to you, let me know. By the way, Neutral Rockets is posted in the chat here. Thoughts on Austrian economics versus Keynesian economics. Austrian economics is the only economics, which we'll dig more into in another episode. Okay, so this basically is showing how the printing of money. This is Australia's national gross domestic product, which is the value of all of the final goods and services produced within a country within a specific period of time. It's our economic output divided by how much money has been printed. And you can see that that is a negative trend. Okay. So what that actually forces, it forces us to rethink what growth means, because GDP can look bigger, but much of that growth is going to be explained by money creation, not productivity. Because GDP number goes up, but actually productivity and productive economic output has gone down. And so the economy is producing less per dollar. So each unit of money now buys only a fraction of the output that it once did. And this is where prosperity begins to unravel, and it starts to hollow out, because actually it looks like the entire economy of Australia has hollowed out once it's adjusted for money. So what we're going to look at now is, what does this look at on a per person basis?
Perfect.
Cool. So now what we're going to look at is GDP per capita divided by M3 money supply. Now, what do I mean by GDP per capita? So GDP per capita is the GDP of the country divided by the population. So it is not just what is the total measurable economic output of a country, but it is also the total measurable economic output of a country divided by the amount of people within the country. Okay. And this is a very important metric, because effectively this is like prosperity per person is the easiest way to think about it.
Yep.
Okay. So when we have a look at the GDP per capita adjusted for M3 money supply growth, this starts to get a little even crazier. Okay. So this is indexed again. So in 1960, the index begins at 100. By 2024, it's collapsed to just 0.73. So that is a 99.3% wipeout in economic output per person relative to the money supply. Just think about that for a moment. In terms of economic output per unit of money, the average Australian today has access to less than 1 cent on the dollar compared to 1960. Now, why this is important is because GDP is typically linked to the prosperity of a nation. A growing GDP means the economy is going well, people are building wealth. You know, it's directly linked. It's like effectively a prosperity measurement, right? And so if you divide GDP by the amount of people, this is like a prosperity per person measurement. Now, what we can see here by looking at this is that, as I mentioned, I'm going to say it again because it is so freaking crazy. In 1960, the index begins at 100. By 2024, it collapsed to 0.73. That's a 99.3% wipeout in economic output per person relative to the money supply. So this is pretty wild. I mean, like the government and policymakers and stuff, they love to point to GDP growing as a measure of prosperity, and they say, look, GDP is going up. Look, everyone's richer, everyone's wealthier, everyone's happier, everything's better. GDP is going up. And let me just go back to highlight that point here. So GDP, look, GDP is going up. GDP is going up. Look how good Australia's going. We're hooning. Effectively, we're making more money. We're making more stuff. We're making more exports. Everything's going good. The economy is going up. If the economy is going up, everyone's getting richer and wealthier and happier and better, and life is good. Everything's great, except for the fact that it is not. It is absolutely crashing. That's on a national level. And then this is on the individual level, which is pretty wild.
Yeah.
So
there's another quick question. So why can we still afford normal things then if there has been such an economic drop?
Yeah, it's a good point. And we're going to cover this a little bit more in some later episodes, but technology. So technology has, and this is something that I call the productivity inflation delta, right? So there's a gap between monetary inflation and technological deflation. So since 1960, technology has improved, which is effectively lowered the cost of manufacturing, lowered the cost of goods and services, lowered the cost of everything, basically, right? You imagine remember the price of a computer in 1980 versus the price of a computer today, right? It's collapsed. TVs, everything like this. Technological advancement has driven costs down significantly. And so there is a delta between this and the real world outcomes of things that you buy, if that makes sense. Because in fact, things should have been getting a lot cheaper. So, yes, everything should have been getting a lot cheaper. Does that make sense? Does that kind of cover that off, or do we need to dig into that a little bit further?
Yeah, there's like there's two competing forces, right? And so we're
Yeah.
seeing the reality that we're seeing is the combination of the two forces. That if money supply hadn't been as growing as rapidly as it has, the prices should have fallen a lot more than they have.
Yeah. So a simple way to think about this, just to kind of give you a mental model for this. Let's say that consumer price inflation, CPI, is 3%. So that's how much like goods and services are going up. But let's say money supply is 10%, is going up by 10%. Then the gap between those two things is 7%. And that 7%, that is the deflationary force that technology is bringing into the market. Because that is the reason that the cost of goods and services didn't go up 10%. They only went up 3%, is because technology gave you 7% cost deflation.
Yeah.
All right. And that's the inflation productivity delta. So
Yep.
Cool. So the interpretation of this chart is this is where the gap between the kind of headline story of GDP goes up and the lived experience becomes really raw. Population props up the aggregate. So overall GDP looks large, partly because there's more people, but individuals aren't capturing all those gains. And this is actually what's been happening over the last few years, particularly, and you probably heard me talk about it, a per capita recession. So GDP has been going up, but on a per capita basis, GDP has been going down, been in negative GDP per capita. I think 17 quarters in a row, or maybe there was one quarter that wasn't it, or it was basically, crazy amount of time, right? So per person, prosperity has collapsed. So adjusted for money, the average Australian has lost nearly all of their relative economic output over 6 decades. Now, the way to think about this, because it's very hard to kind of wrap your head around, is if we didn't have monetary inflation, the inverse of this would be true. So if we didn't have monetary inflation, then the things that cost $100 in 1960, all things being equal, would probably be worth 73 cents today because of technology-based deflation. So the inverse would effectively be true. Now, this is not a chart of CPI, right? So that is a generalized statement to kind of give you a point of view, because we're actually talking about GDP, not costs of goods and services specifically at the moment. But that gives you an idea. So the inverse would be true if monetary inflation didn't exist. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So we keep getting told that the country is getting richer, and we even see wages go up in dollar terms, but everyone still feels like they're falling behind. Now, we can see this in social trends as well. It wasn't that many decades ago when a single income household was the norm, and on a single income, you could buy a home. In fact, in 1983, my parents bought a home on just under one times my dad's income. They had a 2-income household at the time because my brother wasn't born yet, but just on the basis of my dad's income, they bought one home in 1983. In 1975, you could buy a family home in Blacktown in Sydney for $29,000. And so you were very much able to have a single income household and buy a home, have good education for kids, have a great level of prosperity. Now, people often go, oh, but we have so much more stuff now. Like we've got jet skis and I don't know, like electric cars and stuff like that. Like surely that means we have more prosperity, but actually, no, that's just technological advancement. So don't mistake technological progress for enhanced prosperity, right? Because just because in 1950 they didn't have jet skis and electric cars, and just because today we do have jet skis and electric cars, doesn't mean that we're suddenly more prosperous, right? Actually, it just means that we've invented more stuff over that period of time. So it's a very common mental shortcut that people get wrong, that they assume that because there's more technological advancement and we have more things, that means that we're more prosperous. But in fact, technology is so deflationary. The fact that you have more stuff in your home is actually a signal of technology, but not a signal of economic prosperity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a really good point to make, because it's like it's all relative, right? So like if you go back to 1975, single family, single income household could afford a house and could live like a really affluent lifestyle then, compared to average wages compared to average costs of goods and services compared to money supply floating around in the economy.
Yeah.
Compare that to now, and the equations are just so far off that even though the nominal numbers are higher, the relativity is off. Like, that's why we feel that.
Yeah. Totally. And to your point, like, I think about my grandparents, right? And so, if I think about my grandparents and I think about them in like 1950, my granddad worked for the SEC, my grandma was a nurse, pretty classic, kind of classic regional family. Now, they never went on an international trip, aside from my grandma moved over from Scotland to Australia, but they never hopped on a plane and flew around the world, right?
Yep.
And so you can look back and say, oh, but they didn't have that much money because they couldn't afford to like go and like fly to Italy for like 3 months. It's like, yeah, because the technology of planes, the cost of access to that technology hadn't yet deflated enough to make that viable. But that doesn't mean that in relative terms they weren't more well off. So don't like, it's a very easy mistake to make to say that we have more technology today, therefore we're more prosperous. Whereas in fact, if we had all of that technology, then you'd be able to compare apples to apples. So what this is showing is that even as wages go up, so we're going to talk about wages in a second. In terms of relative economic output per individual, things are not looking good. Cool. Now, why does this matter? Basically, let's actually talk about that for a second, right? Because what this explains here, this chart here, the Australian GDP per capita adjusted for M3 money supply growth, explains why so many Australians feel squeezed, even though the economy is supposedly booming. This actually explains it. The national numbers look pretty strong, but on a per person basis, prosperity has almost been completely eroded. So this is probably one of the most important graphs to understand around why is it that no matter like the fact that you're getting a higher paid job, and maybe you've got a 2-income household, all of that kind of stuff, it's getting harder and harder to get ahead. It's because economic output or economic prosperity per person has collapsed since 1960.
Yeah.
Okay. So
you can see the little bump at 1971.
You can see the little bump.
Yep.
Yeah, you can see the little bump in 1971. Now, this doesn't mean that on aggregate, Australia is necessarily producing less stuff, but this is relative to the money supply. Okay, so the money supply is actually distorting the GDP to make it look a lot better than it is. And what we should be living in is a deflationary world, by the way, right? So in practice, everything should, like the value of everything should be going down. So in a free market, all prices fall to the marginal cost of production. So what we should be seeing actually is this, right? We actually should be seeing that the value of the output should be going down because things should be deflating, but it's being distorted by the money supply. And this is where the kind of theft part comes into it, because things are in nominal optical terms more expensive than the real value of what they are. So that's why prosperity per capita has gone down. So clocking, is that linking together correctly?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, so let's take a look at wages. This is where it gets fun too. Average weekly earnings. Now, I did a lot of data gathering for all of this kind of stuff. It's very interesting. So this is the average weekly earnings for an individual, by the way. So this is individual average weekly earnings since 1969 to 2025. And so again, you look at that and you're
on
like,
a dollar basis. Yeah.
On a dollar basis, right? So you're like, okay, awesome. This is great. So in 1969, the average worker earned $60 a week, and the average worker today earns more than $1,500 a week. Awesome. Sick. We're all rich. That's a huge amount of growth. In fact, I should have actually done the calculation on that, but I'm not going to do public maths. That's a tremendous amount of growth, from $60 a week to $1,500 a week since 1969. I mean, that's awesome. Surely we're all richer, right? Surely we are all richer. But once again, this figure is deceptive. If we take wages, and by the way, for the purposes of this next chart, what I did is normalize the wages to household wages. I won't explain the process to do that, but we changed it from household wages, from individual wages to household wages. And then we adjusted it for M3, and then we smoothed it out. So this is wages adjusted for M3, then with a smoothed out rolling 3-year average as well to kind of normalize it out. So what you can see here is, despite the fact that wages have gone from $60 in 1969 to over $1,500 in 2025, the index has fallen from 100 to just 11.6. So that's an 89% collapse in wages relative to money supply. So that's an 89% collapse in relative purchasing power compared to money supply. Now, again, I'll emphasize the fact that the reason that things that you can still afford things is technological advancement. The reason that butter in the supermarket isn't $100 today is because of the technological progress to reduce the cost of production of butter. So the price of butter has continued to go down. Why was Vegemite 50 cents in 1970 and $5 today? Why isn't it 5 cents? It's technological production versus money supply. Okay, so technological advancement. So that the improvements in technology and productivity have been driving prices down. That's the counteracting force against monetary debasement. But what should have been happening is those prices should have been going down, because in a free market, all prices fall to the marginal cost of production. And in real terms, what we've actually lost is 89% of our purchasing power relative to the money. So our wages, 89% loss or decline in wages relative to the money supply. So to put it simply, whilst wages rose in nominal terms, they've lost almost 9/10 of their value relative to the amount of money being created.
Wild.
That's wild. Let me know in the chat if you think that is wild. Is this landing with you guys? Let us know. Let me know in the chat if you guys are still with us, if you guys are tracking all this. Let me know what you think. Let me know if this is making sense to you guys, because it's pretty hectic stuff. Now, the reason the interpretation of this is that pay packets can look larger, but every dollar commands far less output than it did. Labor can't keep up with monetary supply, so the wages aren't keeping up with monetary supply growth. So those wages are losing value relative to the money supply increasing. So a simple way to think about that is wages increase at roughly about 1.5% to 2% a year. Money supply increases by about 10% a year. That's the difference.
Yeah.
That's why, despite the fact that your pay keeps going up, you keep struggling to make ends meet.
Yep.
That's why 10 years ago, an $80,000 salary was a bloody good wicket. Today, $80,000 salary is, for most people are going to struggle on that, to be honest.
Yeah. We're trying to think about an analogy. I think maybe if we just scrap money altogether, if we just use like gold, which is not the wrong thing to replace it with, but let's say like you earned an income in gold. If you got a pay rise and you got slightly more gold, that seems like a good thing to you. But then if you realize that there's actually 10 times more gold in the world than you realized, and the gold is actually worth slightly less, then your pay rise doesn't actually mean anything. Actually, you've gone backwards.
Yeah.
Which is effectively what's happening, right?
Yeah. So if anyone wants to get a really good grasp of the history of money, I would highly recommend reading The Bitcoin Standard by Saifedean Ammous. Now, even though it says the Bitcoin Standard, like 90% of that book is about the history of money.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting. And to your point there, Gabby, so in West Africa, glass beads used to be used as money because they were very hard to make. So the stock to flow ratio was very high because, yes, there were glass beads. They were fairly durable. They were small, so they were easily divisible. They were portable. They were a decent form of money. And glass bead making technology was very rare. It's very hard to make more glass beads in West Africa. Then the Venetians went to West Africa. Or some Europeans. Sorry, some Europeans went to West Africa, and they realized that, and they had, and in Europe they had really good glass making technology, and they realized that everyone in West Africa was using glass beads as money, and they went, "Oh shit, this is a good wicket." So they went back to Europe and they filled up a boat full of glass beads. They went back to West Africa, and they started buying everything in glass beads. And everyone thought, all the West Africans thought that they were getting rich. They're like, "Holy shit, look how many freaking glass beads I've got, man! This is so good." Until they realized that the entire market had been flooded with glass beads, and the glass beads didn't buy them anything, and then they were all impoverished. And the Europeans had bought all the land, robbed all the resources, and basically bankrupted all the individuals because they flooded the market with glass beads, and the glass beads were basically worthless. So what used to cost one glass bead now costs 1,000 glass beads. Right. And this is the exact same. It's the exact same issue. Same thing when in the US, when they used wampum shells as a form of money. Wampum shells were very hard to come by, so they were scarce, hard to reproduce, all of that kind of stuff, until boating technology improved and somebody was able to go out and collect wampum shells out in the ocean and bring back shitloads of them and flood the market with wampum shells. And then it was no good anymore because it flooded the market. This is how we get to currency collapse.
Yeah, it's a perfect story because, again, that's history. That's not a fairy tale. They're situations that actually happen to demonstrate what can happen in terms of increasing money supply. And we just think of it in terms of like dollars and our wages, but it's the same thing recurring now.
Yeah, this is exactly right. So you can replace dollars with glass beads if that's going to help you to kind of think about what's going on here. Because the collapse of wages relative to the money supply explains why so many Australians feel like they're running harder just to stand still.
Mm-hmm.
That's also why people can't retire properly anymore. Because once upon a time, you would be able to save up a bunch of money, you'd be able to save up a nice little nest egg, and you'd be able to sit on that nest egg, except that nest egg's devaluing at about 10% a year. So you may run out of money before you die, and that's a pretty scary thing. So it also explains why there's been a deeper social shift that labor alone is no longer enough to secure prosperity. If your only income's wages, then you're on the losing side of a system where the money supply is expanding faster than your pay. And that is why investing is no longer something that is an optional, right? So back in 1969 or back in 1960, 1970, you didn't really need to, because money supply wasn't. If we go back up to the GDP adjusted for the money supply growth, so you can see here, GDP was doing just fine when we weren't printing money out the wazoo. Okay.
Yep.
And when that was the case, you didn't really need to invest, because actually prosperity per person was actually doing pretty good, right? I mean, it's still per capita. We had a lot of immigration, right? So, but generally speaking, the economy was doing better. Now, you could choose to invest, but you didn't need to. But now you can see the wages divided by the money supply. There is no chance that just by working, you're going to get ahead. You have to invest. And this is actually a big shift. This is actually a big social shift that's happening in Australia, and around the world, but like specifically in Australia, because effort is not being rewarded in the way that it once was. You used to be able to work hard and have a good life. You didn't have to invest, but now you can work hard and just get behind. And that's not the social contract that everyone signed up for.
No, it's not the Australian dream, is it?
No. And this is a breakdown in the social contract. The social contract is effectively, if you work hard, you can provide for your family and you can live a good life in Australia. That's the Australian dream, right? If you work hard, you'll be able to buy a family home. Your kids will get a good education, and you'll live a good life, right? Not necessarily super yachts and whatever, but a good life. But then the government goes and prints more money, and they're actually stealing the prosperity away from the individual, and you can no longer get ahead. And so now that social contract is completely toast. Okay, should we move on to the next point?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting as well. So you know that we love property, and I'm going to say some stuff here that is going to probably challenge some people. Some people might not even like it, actually. But we're going to be talking about housing, and we're going to be talking about housing and how this fits into the picture, because it's very interesting. So this is where the rubber meets the road for most people, because housing costs, whether they be rent or mortgages, are the biggest expense for everyday Australians. Makes up the biggest part of everybody's personal expense kind of bracket. And so this is kind of the biggest marker of how things play out. Now, this is dwelling prices versus wages indexed at 100 back to 1980. So you can see here that dwelling prices have massively accelerated further ahead than wages.
Mm-hmm.
So the actual cost to buy a house is flying ahead, and we kind of know this. Right? This is not shocking. Yep. We know this. This is not shocking. But if you remember that this is wages divided by M3 money supply, and then you see house prices are going up, you can see why it's getting harder to get ahead. You can see why once upon a time you could buy a home on a single income, and you can see why most parents today are incredibly worried about what's going to happen for their kids in the future, whether they're even going to be able to buy a home. If we look at it over a sort of slightly shorter time frame, since 2011, you can see that the difference is still pretty stark as well. So so this kind of tells a pretty obvious story, right? House price affordability is getting a lot worse relative to wages. So then I looked at what is the house price to income ratio, and I thought this is pretty interesting, right? So this is the house price to income ratio. So how much does it cost to buy a house relative to household income, by the way? So this shows you that in 1980, the average house cost around 7 times the annual income. Now, by the way, that's the average house. That includes capital cities and stuff. So I mentioned earlier, my parents were able to buy a house in 1983 for $35,000, and my dad was earning about 35 grand a year, right? But that was in a regional area. So, actually, this isn't off household. This is off average individual weekly earnings as well. So by the mid 1980s, that figure had fallen to about 5.5 times. So this is a period where wages caught up. And if we go back to here, you can actually see in the first part of this, wages were actually above house prices for a little period of time here. So you can see in this little gap here, this is where wages were outstripping house prices.
Yeah, and that's where the story made sense, right? It's probably where the story originated, just before that period, because it's like you go into the worker bee environment and work hard, get a manufacturing job or something, put in a year or two of labor, and you get a house. And that was the deal, basically.
Yeah, totally. So now it went from, in the mid 1980s, it was about 5.5x was the house price to income ratio, but by the early 2000s, it had gone to about 9 to 10x. And then by 2025, the average house costs about 12.9 times annual income. So we'll call it 13 times annual income, which is crazy.
Yeah.
So what about years to save for a 20% deposit? I thought this was interesting. So it depends on, and I had to kind of stitch a bunch of data.
This one's crazy. They're all crazy, but this is,
I had to stitch a bunch of data together to kind of work this out. So this is a composite of about 3 or 4 different data sets, but this is the best that I could calculate it. And it depends on so currently the average household saves 5% of their income. So it depends on whether you want to use a 5% basis or a 10% basis or a 15% basis of savings rate. That kind of shows you. So that's why we've included all three lines here. So what this shows is that in the 1980s, saving 5% of your income was enough to reach a 20% deposit in 7 to 10 years. By 2025, saving 5% of your income would take 41 years to save for a deposit. And by the way, 5% is the average household savings rate at the moment in 2025. So and based on the average income, based on the average income and the average house price and the average savings rate, it takes about 41 years.
Of household income.
Yeah, of household income. Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So we covered that off in last week's episode, because I did a bunch of work on that. And yeah, it's absolutely bonkers. So I'm just going from here, but the average household income is about $98,000. 5% savings rate is about $4,950, I think. And the mean house price is about $1 million. So 20% deposits like 200 grand. So yeah, it's about 40 times to get to, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
So this is why, it used to be like climb the property ladder is what people would say. But it doesn't feel like a ladder anymore. It feels like a wall. Like it feels like, how are you supposed to get over that? Like there's nothing to climb. Like it's just this big wall that you're running into, that everyone's running into and they're struggling with. So, so you can see
because even if, again, you go back in time, you think through like the average household income, they could afford, like relative lifestyle affordability was lower. So they could afford to save a bigger portion. So they could save their deposit even quicker. So that's why, whereas now it's so hard even just to get to 5% or 10% deposit.
Yeah. So if you were to draw a line through here, there's a you're exactly right. So there'd be a relationship between, in the 1980s, you were probably able to save 15% of your income, right? So it would
We
have
can't
been
see
more
your
like
cursor
here.
if you're pointing
Oh,
somewhere.
you can't see the cursor? Okay.
No.
So yeah, so the green line in 1980, probably in the 1980 to 1990 period is probably where that was. But then in today, it's the
the
yellow
top.
line, orange line. It's the top line
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
2020 plus. So then if you drew a diagonal line between those 2 points, that would sort of probably give you the rough directionality of where the kind of average savings rates needed to be. It's pretty crazy. It's pretty crazy.
And again, we talk about this on the show a lot, but like that delta between like 41 years, that's you just saving on a cash basis as a percentage of your income. If you don't want to wait 41 years, you are more than welcome to want to buy a home, totally. But there are smarter ways than waiting 41 years to save that deposit. You can find other ways to invest to be able to.
Well, the point is you wouldn't be able to anyway. The point is you wouldn't be able to, because even if you decided to try and save for 41 years, that's longer than most people are in the workforce. Well, maybe not, but maybe not anymore. But the other thing is prices are going to continue to increase, and wages don't keep up with monetary inflation, and they don't keep up with they don't keep up with property prices. So if wages don't keep up with property prices, and property prices keep accelerating away, by the time you get to 41 years, it's probably 81 years. So the point here is it's actually an unwinnable game. So the only way that you can get to a place where you can buy the home that you want is you need to invest. You need to find ways to accelerate your capital.
Yep.
So let's have a look at house prices divided by M3 money supply, because this is super interesting. This is controversial because you can see here that house prices in relative terms are not very expensive. Everyone keeps going on about house price affordability. Oh my God, house prices are through the roof. House prices are crazy. House prices are at an all-time high. House prices have never been more expensive. But actually, once you divide it by M3 money supply, you'll actually find that house prices have gone down. So since 2011, house prices have actually gone from so they've gone down by about 13% since between 2011 and 2025 relative to money supply growth. Now, that might be a little bit confusing to people. Like, what? That's crazy. What do you mean house prices have gone down? But it's pretty simple when you think about it. So the average house price growth in Australia since 1980-ish is about 8.25%. The average M3 money supply growth is about 10%. So money supply is growing faster than house prices. So in relative terms, house prices have actually been going down versus the money supply. But the reason that they feel so crazy expensive and it feels so hard to get into is because wages also have not been keeping up with money supply. So wages have been going down in relative terms versus money supply. House prices have still been going up relative to wages. And so our income is lagging behind the reality. Now, by the way, it might seem like a contentious point that house prices have been going down relative to money supply. And that may seem a little daunting and like, what? This is not the narrative that we get told, that property prices go up and they're a good inflation hedge and everything like that. By the way, it's still actually gone down only a little bit. So I would just say that for the first instance. But also it makes sense. It actually makes sense. So houses used to be built with higher quality materials. So you would have double brick houses and all of this kind of stuff. They were built with higher quality materials.
Yep.
And so the quality of a building historically versus a quality of building today, they're two different things. So necessarily you would expect a building made out of cheaper building products that have been made cheaper through technology would cost less to build in relative terms today than, say, a house in 1960 that was built with double brick and all of this other kind of stuff. But the thing is, the houses that were built in the past that were built out of more expensive materials, more expensive, all of that kind of stuff, they've actually degraded, right? So they've actually gotten worn out, weather, time, degradation. So those houses that were made out of more expensive stuff in relative terms have weathered and gotten old, so they've depreciated in value. And then newer houses are made out of cheaper shit, so they're actually worth less in real terms than the houses that were built in the past. And so necessarily you would reasonably expect that in real terms, house prices would go down relative to the money supply. Now, this is not relative to, there's a whole bunch of other ways to carve up this cake, but I think this is a very interesting chart to look at. What do you think about this one, Gabby?
I think we shouldn't tell the mainstream media that prices are actually going down.
Yeah, it would force them to confront what is the real issue then, isn't it? Right? Like it would force them to confront, like, maybe you should stop printing money so much.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
Because that's actually the real problem. That's actually that's the root problem, is that because money printing is so voracious, it is robbing everyone's purchasing power and making people feel poor. It is making houses feel out of reach. It's making cost of goods and services go up. All of this kind of stuff. And so that is actually the theft, because in real terms versus the money supply, housing prices have gone down versus the money supply. And if that was allowed to happen and we didn't print so much money, then houses would. Now, there's a demand side issue with population and everything like that. It's a little bit more to the story here, but it's interesting to consider the relationship between M3 money supply and house prices.
Yeah.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, shit, well, what's the point of buying property then if it's just going to go down versus the money supply? That's not the whole story. Okay, that's not the whole story. I would agree that there is no real point in buying properties in cash unless you are a high net worth individual and really just what you want to do is collect the rents. So there's a point to it if all you want is a rental income stream and you're not trying to seek major value creation or anything like that, right? There can be a point. But for 99.99999% of people, buying properties in cash doesn't make sense. There's actually way better things you could do to invest your capital in. Leverage is what makes real estate work. So leverage is the wealth amplifier. So even though property prices since 2011 have gone down relative to the amount of money that has been printed, which is just something. Look at this, by the way. like bang. COVID.
Yeah.
So you might be thinking like, well, what's the point, right? So and the point is, if you use leverage, the story is completely different. So this is based on an 80% LVR and have indexed house prices versus M3, which is the bottom line, and leveraged equity. So we took an 80% LVR and modeled what those returns would be. And leverage is really the wealth amplifier here. So if we bought a home in 2011 for a median house price of $489,000 with an 80% LVR, that'll give you an initial equity of $98,000. By 2025, the mean property price is $1,002,500, and that means the equity would have risen to $611,000. That's a 6.3x increase on $98,000, 6.3x. So your capital would have increased by 6.3 times. But you then have to divide that by M3 money supply, and you would still be up by 2.7x, right? So just a simple 80% LVR loan on a property is going to help you to amplify your capital 2.7 times more than the money supply growth over 2011 to 2025. So whatever that period is, 14 years, whatever it is, right? 13 years. So this is why it makes sense. This is why residential real estate is one of my favorite assets, because there's a huge amount of underpinning demand for it, and leverage is the thing that actually allows you to grow your wealth. So,
then the ironic part with that as well, obviously, that like a big driver of house prices is money supply flowing into housing as a safe asset. So it's like you're riding it either way by doing this kind of a approach.
You touch on a really good point. So credit creation contributes to money supply increase. Leverage is credit. Leverage is credit. Credit increases money supply. Money supply increases house prices optically. So your house price is going to go up. But this is also why you need. So this is why debt can actually be useful, because if you get $1 million worth of debt today and they debase the value of that debt by 10% a year, that is going to be worth a lot less in a few years' time. But that's also why if you divide the equity by the money supply, you actually want to work out, are you still getting ahead in net terms? So even though the house prices might go up, if you're contributing to the money supply going up by increasing the credit, all of that kind of stuff, you then still need to divide it by the total money supply increase. Then you still get your net equity amplifier, which in this case is you would have outperformed money supply growth by 2.7 times on a single property with an 80% LVR, which is bloody awesome, by the way, because the S&P 500 doesn't do that. There's I don't think the NASDAQ would do that. I'd have to double check, but you would struggle to find many assets that are actually going to do that. And that's just the reality. Most commodities won't do that. You would hate to see what happened when I divided gold by M3 money supply. That was a pretty wild experience. Trying to work out. That was a pretty wild experience. I'm not ready to share that yet, but that was a pretty wild experience. So most assets are not going to outperform money supply growth, whereas residential real estate in Australia, because it has such a structural underpinning and such a huge amount of demand and such a stable and safe asset. Neil Amigam has said it's 1.7 times, I think. No, it's 2.75 times. So it's 2.7 times the growth of the money supply. So this is why residential real estate is so good, because you can outperform it. Now, there are some other assets where you can outperform as well. So some technology, Bitcoin. So residential real estate is not the only way, but it's a bloody good way. It's one of the best risk-adjusted ways. And so all of this kind of points to why it's getting harder to get ahead. So just going to recap on it. So at the systemic level, GDP versus M3 money supply. So the economy looks like it's grown from 20 billion to 2.6 trillion. So 20 billion in 1960 to 2.6 trillion today. But actually, when adjusted for money supply, the output per unit of money has fallen by 78%. So what looks like an expanding economy is in large part the effect of monetary inflation. So the cake looks bigger only because the knife slicing it has grown even faster, right? So it's like, looks bigger, but it's not really, right? Or the cake looks bigger, but you just put it on a smaller table, right? You know what I mean? It's not really the same thing. At the individual level, GDP per capita has collapsed. So when we look at the individuals, in 1960, GDP per capita relative to money supply begins at an index of 100, and by 2024, it's just 0.73. So it's a 99.3% wipeout of prosperity per person relative to money, which means that for the average Australian, almost all of the supposed gains economically over the last 60 years vanish once we account for monetary expansion. At the individual level, at the employment level, wages versus M3 money supply. So wages rose from $60 in 1969 to more than $1,500 today, but relative to money supply, wages have collapsed from 100 indexed at 100 in 1969 to 11.6 in 2025. So that's 89% collapse. That's an 89% collapse in wages relative to money supply since 1969. So that the illusion of higher pay packets disappears once you realize that money is being debased faster than wages are growing. So money is being debased faster than your wages are going. Not even just savings, right? So money is being debased faster than your wages, which is crazy. At the household level, household affordability has collapsed. So price to income ratios have rose from 9x in 2011 to, they rose from actually 5.5x in, sorry, I need to update my stuff here. They rose from about 5.5x in the mid 1980s. To 12.9x in 2025. Saving a deposit now takes 41 years. Relative to housing supply, relative to money supply, housing has actually underperformed marginally since 2011. But when applying leverage, you've outperformed money supply by 2.7x. So this is a pretty interesting picture. So what do you think about all this?
I was just thinking, because there's been a couple of questions that have come through about relating to debt on property. I just thought I'd pull some up.
Yep, perfect.
So we've got from Pete B. With decreased money velocity, increased financialization, especially to housing, where mortgage debt's 60% of bank lending. Doesn't this expose Australian residential housing market to potential instability?
Can you make the question bigger? I think I need to read it.
Yeah.
With decreased money velocity, increased financialization, especially to housing where mortgage debt, 60% of bank lending, does this expose Australia? No. So there's only on $11.4 trillion of roughly $11.4 trillion of Australian residential real estate, only $2.4 trillion of that is levered. So $8.9 trillion of the value of the Australian housing market is unlevered equity. So it's not like the Australian housing market is getting overlevered, not by a long shot, actually. So percentage of bank lending, I mean, that's really doesn't really mean a lot. I don't think you actually need to look at the whole macro spectrum. And yeah, as I say, $11.4 trillion in Australian residential real estate and only $2.4 trillion in mortgages. That doesn't say that we have a highly leveraged, highly volatile asset. If we got to 50 or 60% levered, right? So if there was 11.4 trillion, if there was 11.4 trillion in residential real estate and like, I don't know, 6 trillion in debt, then yeah, maybe we'd have a little bit more volatility or there'd be a bit more concern, but it's 2.4. So I'm not really concerned about that at the moment. Where was the first part of that with decreased money velocity? So I haven't looked a lot, Pete, into the decreased money velocity at the moment. So I can look a little bit more into that, but I can't speak to the money velocity conversation at the moment because that's not where I've been looking. But I'm not concerned about housing market credit instability at all. I think that's an overblown risk.
Yeah, okay. There's another related question, which is a good one just to mention now. Could they be getting everyone in on huge mortgages right now at overinflated land prices to then crash the market when everyone is over leveraged?
Why would they do that? Who's they?
What's the incentive?
Yeah, what's the incentive, right? So I don't think that's the case at all. I think that governments want to stay elected and they want the economy to go well. There's no value in a government creating a system where they overinflate prices and then rug pull everyone so that everything collapses. Do you remember what percentage of household wealth is in real estate? It's 60%, isn't it? Roughly?
Yeah.
60%.
56 or something. Yeah.
Yeah. So between 55 and 60% of household wealth is in real estate in Australia. And so if you tanked that, you'd collapse the entire economy. The whole thing would crash. And so I actually think the opposite is true. I think that yes, they are doing things that are artificially inflating property prices, but I don't think that that's creating a bubble. I just think they'll continue to underpin that structurally. So you can see that with a lot of the policies they're doing, like the first home guarantee scheme that's just injecting credit into the market.
Yep.
They will pursue any policy that stops the housing market crashing. The reason being is they just can't afford it. So the banks would collapse. If the banks collapsed, the whole economy would be screwed.
Yep.
So everything would go bad. So there's no incentive. There's no reason that they would do that. There's no economic incentive. There's no social incentive. There's no political incentive. I actually think the opposite is true. I think rather than letting the free market find its own equilibrium, they will continue to pursue activities which continue to prop up the property market on the long term.
Yeah. Great.
Sweet. Any other questions?
Do we want to go straight through all the questions, or do we want to?
We can do a couple. I mean, what do you think about all of this? Where do you want to go with this? Oh, actually, there's still more stuff for us to talk about, right? So,
yeah, I just noticed there was a part 6.
Yeah. So the reason, so basically all of this points to, like, hopefully everyone's understanding, and this is only just the tip of the iceberg. So we're going to do a multi-part series that starts to unpack this further and further. The point of this episode was really just to kind of show you, this is why it's feeling like it's getting harder to get ahead. Money supply is going through the roof, and in relative terms, everyone is feeling the squeeze. Wages, cost of living, like it's crushing everything down. So cash is losing value. So you can't save in cash. You want to keep it. You want to keep your cash limited to what you need for transactions. It should be viewed as a medium of exchange only. I think not to I don't like talking about our finances too much, but I think only 2% of our liquid net worth is in cash, or maybe even 1% or something like that, right? So we try to keep as little in cash as possible. So cash should be seen as a medium of exchange, but not a store of value. What is important if you want to get ahead is you need to make sure you're investing in assets or investing in ways that beat monetary debasement. That's the only way to get ahead, because where we're going, and we've talked about this before, we're creating a bifurcated society of consumers and asset owners, right? Yeah. So consumers and owners. There's people that own the assets, own the assets that are growing faster than monetary debasement, and then there's consumers. And if you want to get ahead, and if you want to help your family to get ahead, you need to be making sure you're investing in hard assets. Now, there's many things you could do. We're not advocates of gold, right? So you could buy gold. That's a hard asset. There's plenty of hard assets, right? But from our point of view, the most important things in hierarchical order that you should be thinking about investing in is residential real estate in Australia, because that's the best risk-adjusted return that I can find, then Bitcoin, then technology in that order. Now, Bitcoin may or may not grow faster than some of the technology stocks over the next 5 years, but the technology stocks have higher risk. So you need to be careful about your allocation there. Bitcoin should be seen as a way to take your money out of a monetary inflation system, and residential real estate should be seen as a way to amplify your capital. Because as you can see from the example that I used earlier, simply using an 80% LVR over the 2011 to 2025 created a 2.7 times outperformance versus monetary debasement. And that's the kind of thing you need to do. That's exactly what you need to do. And so debt can actually be useful, because if you can use debt to buy hard assets like residential real estate, debt devalues over time as they print more money. So just in the same way that $100 in 1960 was worth a lot more in real terms than $100 today, you could buy a lot more stuff. You could buy, I don't know, maybe 2 months worth of groceries with $100 in 1960. You could buy, I don't know, like, I'm not sure if you can buy a week's worth of groceries for $100 in Australia now? I'm not sure. Probably not, right?
No.
I don't think so. I don't know. We live in Thailand now, so we don't know. But the point is, like, $100 in 1960 versus $100 today. $100 was worth a lot more in 1960 than it was today. So if you borrow, Blake says no way. So you can't. Right, there we go. Great, case in point. I didn't think you could. So the point here is, if you borrow dollars today and pay them back in the future, and the government's going to continue to debase the currency, that means that in relative terms in the future, your debt is worth less. So if you borrowed $100 off someone in 1960, it didn't have to pay them back until 2025, right? Like the relative value of that, your wages would have gone up from whatever $60 to $1,500. So even in relative to your wages, it's a lot less. And this is the whole idea of using debt as it actually deflates. The value of the debt deflates relative to the monetary inflation. So, and by the way, yes, things are getting harder to get. It's getting harder to get ahead. That doesn't mean people are shut out. It just means you need to play the game a little bit differently. So, what used to work in the past doesn't work today. So, what you need to do is you need to become aware of the situation you're in, aware of the environment you're in, aware of how the game is being set up, so that you can work out how to play the game better. Generational divides are not destiny, right? So you can look at the boomers and shake your fist and be like, oh, they had it easy and they're all rich. That is not going to get you anywhere. You know, you might as well just be a sort of crazy old man waving your fist at the sky and shouting like, this is not fair. You can play the game differently. And if you understand how to play the game, you can get ahead. You can get ahead rapidly. And it's actually one of the most important things you can do. So all of this is setting people up to have better optics on the current environment and what to do about it. And again, we're going to cover in a bunch of more episodes. This is the opening chapter. This is the opening of it, right? So don't expect this isn't the resolution. This is the setup. This is the guys, you need to look at this and you need to understand that this is what's happening in Australia relative to money supply. Over the next few episodes, we're going to unpack that further, and we're also going to give you more practical tools on what to do about it. But the very simple thing, the very practical tool to take away today is that you need to invest in assets that are going to outpace monetary debasement. That's the first thing you need to do. That's the fundamental underpinning. That's what we're trying to help people to do. Now, we believe that residential real estate, as I've said, is the best risk-adjusted return asset you can get. It's also hard to get into. So maybe it's not right for everyone at the right time. But if you can adapt, if you can understand the environment you're in, then you can achieve real prosperity for you and your family. And that is the kind of key message. So the question is, are you going to cling to the old kind of system and slip backwards, or are you going to embrace a new way forward and find prosperity and reclaim control of your financial future? So that is where I got to. What do you think? Do you think this is useful?
Totally. Like it. Yeah. Let us know, guys, in the chat.
Let us know in the chat. I wonked out on this for a fair bit this week. So to me, this was really, really interesting. But I would love to know from you guys in the chat if you think this is interesting. Because to me, when I started cracking this open, look, and I had a pretty good idea about all this kind of stuff. Once I actually started running the numbers and doing those charts, I was like, what? Seriously?
This is why.
It's that bad? Because I knew it was bad, but I hadn't really done those. Well, I hadn't made those graphs. I hadn't done those formulas in those ways. And so it really, to me, was like, wow, this is shocking. This is absolutely shocking. And that's actually what prompted us to want to do this episode, because it was like, well, everyone needs to know how bad this is. Like, sometimes you need to be slapped in the face with the reality to know how bad it is, to then get your ass off the couch to go freaking do something. So yeah, let us know in the chat if you found this useful. Yeah. So Harpreet says, best episode yet. Very useful and shocking. Awesome. Well, I'm glad to do this best episode yet. Yeah, there's a lot in there.
I was just remembering, like, a little while ago, Josh actually said we truly are hitting maximum velocity of monetary debasement. And
so go keep going.
No, like, I think, again, it's kind of like if you've listened to anything you've shared over the past year, it's like we kind of get this picture again. We think we sit in the reality of our everyday experience and we can feel that. And we're like, it's not as easy as it used to be. Surely, like, why is this so difficult? But like, you see these charts, and what springs into my mind is like, okay, but where does this end? Like, what? Like, surely we're approaching the end. Like, all of those charts are like basically at zero. Like, what happens? And I think particularly like what we're going to dive into in the next episode is a lot about like people's trust in money and the economic systems, and what happens when trust completely just corrodes, right?
Yeah, exactly. So by the way, a couple of things. So if you are wondering where does all this go, I put a lot of thought into it, and I wrote a paper called Prosperity Wave Thesis. You can get that in the Investor Lab community. It's the only place you can get it. It's free. It's free to join the community. It's free to get the report. There's no catch. You don't need to, don't need to buy anything. No one's going to call you. Just join the community and go to the white papers section, and you'll see my white paper on the Prosperity Wave Thesis. And that actually does point to the fact that we will have a major shift in our economic structures. I think we really, really will. In fact, I'm halfway through a video where two AIs were tasked with coming up with a new economic model. It's very interesting, actually. Super interesting. They basically said capitalism doesn't work and socialism doesn't work, so we need to invent a new economic model. So I'm partway through that video, which is super interesting.
Oh, you should share that in the community for sure.
Yeah. I wanted to finish it first before I shared it, just to make sure.
They're like, kill everyone. Like, shit.
just to make sure I understand what I'm sharing. So there's that. But you're right. Like this is reaching a crescendo. This has to reach a crescendo. Now, to your point, Gabby, on the charts, they look like they're at the bottom. But if you zoomed in on one piece, it would still
there's still some decimals in there.
Yeah. There's like, it's a fractal. It goes all the way down, right? So it could go. It could go 20 times worse, and it would just change the angle. Like the numbers would just stretch out, right? So, and this is the thing with exponentials. But the point here is that money supply is increasing at an exponential rate. And actually, let me just quickly get a definition for you, because the money supply is increasing at a super exponential rate. Define super exponential. So a super exponential function or process is one that grows faster than any exponential function, such as EX or BX. So basically, anyway, I won't wonk out on you, but I actually worked it out that N3 money supply is not growing at an exponential rate in Australia. It's growing at a super exponential, which is crazy. And so then necessarily you do achieve escape velocity at some point where it's like, and we're going to talk about that. It's going to be next week's episode. I really wanted to bolt it onto this one because there's some really like brain meltingly interesting stuff to talk about, well, what happens when you lose faith in a currency? What happens? Should I read the Mises quote now, or should we just save that for the next episode? Should I read the Mises quote now?
Yeah, we can read it again next week.
Yeah. All right. So just because
when you shared that with me, I was like,
only because you stuck around only because you guys stuck around to the end, right? I want to read you a quote from Ludwig von Mises, who was an Austrian economist. He wrote a book called Human Action, which was a fantastic book on Australian economics. Now, he wrote, and I'll read you this quote. But then, finally, the masses wake up. They become suddenly aware of the fact that inflation is a deliberate policy and will go on endlessly. A breakdown occurs. The crack-up boom appears. Everybody is anxious to swap his money against real goods, no matter whether he needs them or not, no matter how much money he has to pay for them. Within a very short time, within a few weeks or even days, the things which were used as money are no longer used as media of exchange. They become scrap paper. Nobody wants to give away anything against them. It was this that happened with the continental currency in America in 1781, with the French mandats territoriaux in 1796, and with the German mark in 1923. It will happen again whenever the same conditions appear. If a thing has to be used as a medium of exchange, public opinion must not believe that the quantity of this thing will increase beyond all bounds. Inflation is a policy that cannot last. And so everything that we've covered, that was in 1949. So everything that we've covered today is kind of showing you, it's kind of like, I'm trying to touch on that first bit, like when finally the masses wake up. If everyone can start to understand that this is a systemic issue here. Now, you could use that to your advantage, by the way. If you could absolutely use that to your advantage. Like if you knew that the wind was going to blow in a certain direction and you wanted to sail as far as you could, you would set your sail in the direction the wind is blowing. Perfect. Awesome. So this isn't something to be afraid of. It is something to understand and benefit from. But I find it so interesting that when the masses finally wake up, and they become suddenly aware of the fact that inflation is a deliberate policy and will go on endlessly, public opinion must not believe that the quantity of this thing will increase beyond all bounds. And I think that people are starting to question what is going on. And I think that the media don't understand it. I think the politicians don't understand it genuinely. I don't think that they're malicious. I think they're stupid. I think that people aren't really understanding the primary issue is monetary supply. And that is driving everything. And eventually people are going to wake up and they're going to realize that is the problem, that everything's going to change. So anyway, that's what we're going to cover. We're going to dig into that a lot next week because I'm very, very into that topic. Was to understand. But anyway, anything else we want to cover off today, Gabby?
Did you want to do questions? I should have done a call out for questions a couple of minutes ago, but just scrolling through.
Neutral Rocket said, is gold being revalued? I don't know, Neutral Rockets, if gold is being revalued. Maybe. I doubt it. The US government has openly said that they're not going to revalue gold. And let me refresh my thinking on that. But I actually did a bunch of thinking about that. And I actually didn't. If the US revalued their gold supply, I don't actually think it would change the value of gold broadly. I think it would only change the value of the gold on the US balance sheet. Because the spot market has gold at whatever, $4,000 or whatever it is. Don't quote me on that. Whatever it is. True, they usually do talk shit. But if all you did was revalue, because like if you think about it, the value of the gold that US has got already is the market value. Just on their balance sheet, it's different. So if they revalued the gold, if they mark to market the gold on their balance sheet, it's actually not going to change the value of gold globally because you're not introducing more supply. It's just a balance sheet transfer. So it's not going to change. It's not going to mean that suddenly gold price goes to $20,000 just because the US has decided that their gold is valued at market value. Does that make sense? They're not fundamentally changing the market value of gold. They're just marking to market what they have on their balance sheet. So I don't know that it would actually have that much of an impact on gold prices. Which is interesting.
Cool. Another question from R. Thanks for joining us today, by the way, R. Quick one. If all this money is being printed, where is the money going? If it's not going to us or property, which is going down versus M3, where is it moving towards? Paying debt?
Yeah. So it is going to property, by the way. So it is going to property because in relative terms, property is still outperforming wages, cost of living, all of that kind of stuff. So in relative terms, property is still going up versus incomes and stuff like that. So it is still flowing to real estate. So that's one thing. That's a big part of it. And so as money supply increases, it does flow to real estate. It's just that it's not quite at the same rate. Right? So it's definitely still flowing there. But it's going to debts, it's going to deficits, it's going to infrastructure program, it's going to basically reckless spending. Right? Yeah. It's going to fund. So here's one way to think about it. All of the prosperity that Australians enjoy, good infrastructure, reasonably good, public services and infrastructure, although they used to be better for sure than they are today. Good rule of law, like generally a good society. That level of prosperity is being robbed from the future by the printing of money. So it goes to pay for things that we can't afford, basically. Mm-hmm. Now, if they stop printing money, what's interesting is that the cost of everything would go down because technological deflation would drive the cost of everything down. But the velocity of money would decrease and governments would be able to collect less on taxes and all of this kind of stuff. And so they keep printing more to be able to fund more stuff. And it's basically just a roundabout. They print more money so they can spend more money, so they can collect more money, so they can spend more money, so they can print more money. It's just a roundabout, basically.
Yeah. Also, anything that we do military-based.
Yeah, totally. And overseas, I was followed up. Is it going out of Australia? Is that a big part? No, Australia is a net capital importer. So Australia actually absorbs capital from the rest of the world. So Australia is a net capital importer, not a net capital exporter, which is an important thing to consider as well. And by the way, this isn't an Australian problem. This is a global problem. This is happening everywhere. This is happening in, if you want to really go freak yourself out, go have a look at Chinese M2 versus, like, everyone thinks the US has got a money printing problem. Just go and look at Chinese M2 money supply versus US M2 money supply. Like, it's crazy. It's like they've invented new money printing technology somehow. It's like they've worked out how to supercharge money printers. I don't know how they print money that quickly. I mean, it's just zeros. They could just type zeros into a machine, but it's just crazy the rate that they're increasing money. So this is happening everywhere. This is not an Australian specific problem. We've just framed it in an Australian specific context for you guys. So sweet, awesome,
cool, great.
Okay, so just quickly, if you haven't already joined the community, join the community. There's a link in the description in the show notes. We are going to turn this research into a report. We're going to put this into the community as well. Gabby's going to do that today or tomorrow. So it'll be there in the next couple of days. If you join the community, we'll let you know once it's been posted in there. There's a whole bunch. You'll get all the graphs, plus you'll get narrative, plus you'll get everything like that. So you can go away and take it and think about it. You can share it with friends and all that kind of stuff. And you can show people and you can use that however you want. That's available in the community only. If you want to know where all this is going, again, Prosperity Wave Thesis, that is again in the community as well. So you can get all that kind of free in there. Next week, we're going to be covering currencies and all kinds of other fun stuff as we progress on this journey of why it's getting harder to get ahead and what to do about it. That's all for now. Thanks, guys.
Amazing. See you on the inside. Thanks, guys. See you next week.